Hello, my name is Neil Pease. I'm a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and this is the third in a series of lectures that I have been invited to record for public viewing by the Cultural Committee of the Polish Center of Wisconsin in Franklin, outside of Milwaukee. And the subject for today's talk is, as you can see on the slide, the good name of Poland, the Polish Holocaust Speech Law of 2018 and its historical background. Now, this is an adaptation and an updating of a talk that I originally gave on the same subject in 2018 on the UW Milwaukee campus at the invitation of Milwaukee's Holocaust Education Research Center. I should mention, as I do always, that the views that I express in this lecture are mine alone and not necessarily those of the Polish Center of Wisconsin. And that might be of particular value to remind you of today, because what I want to do is to speak on what is by all odds the most contentious issue currently under discussion, having to do with the history of Poland, the recent history of Poland, and it has to do with the Second World War and the Holocaust. And as I say, it's an updating because even as I speak, and in February of 2021, there have been new developments in matters relating to this subject that literally have been the stuff of headlines in the last week or so. And so I wanted to bring those into the discussion as well. Now, the picture that you see in this slide, and that you also see here, is of the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, in February 2018, announcing that his government will, in fact, sign a law recently passed by the Polish legislature, and that was advanced by the Polish government of then and now, represented by the Law and Justice Party. Law and Justice Party took office in 2015 and, as I speak, continues to run the government of Poland to this day. And you see here in this slide two of the main figures in the Law and Justice government, the party leader Jarosław Kaczynski on the left and the prime minister of the country, Mateusz Morawiecki. Now, Law and Justice came to part of the program of Law and Justice when they came to power in 2015 was part of the party platform was an official encouragement of a patriotic vision of Polish history, which many of its supporters saw as little known or misunderstood and even under attack by falsehood or by ignorance. And the law that President Duda said that he was prepared to sign was one of the fruits of this law and justice policy. And you see it here represented in this slide. And it's very text heavy. Apologies for that. I don't know how to make it sexier. But the text is important. Now, the official name for this was, as you see on the bottom, the Amendment to the Act on the Institute of National Remembrance Law. But it came to be commonly known as the Polish Holocaust Speech Law. Now, as you can see here, what you have are two parts of Article 55. And the first part of that, the large paragraph at the top, basically says, look, anyone who deliberately ascribes to the Polish nation or the Republic of Poland responsibility or co-responsibility for Nazi crimes committed during the Second World War, in other words, the Holocaust, well, they will be liable to a fine or imprisonment for up to 3 years. The second part of that says that, well, if this is an unintentional offense, then it's simply a matter of a fine, not of imprisonment. The third part states that if the criminal act, so-called criminal act, is committed in the course of one's artistic or academic activity, let's say by an artist or a writer or a novelist or a professor, a historian, they are exempted from this. But there's more on that I'll get to later in the talk. And notice a curious element down in Article 55b, that this doesn't apply simply to Polish citizens or anyone operating inside Poland. This act shall apply to Polish and foreign citizens, and it doesn't matter what the law of that different country might be. Well, anyway, this was passed by the Polish Parliament, and it was signed by the President in February of 2018, and immediately stirred a worldwide protest, the likes of which had not been seen in Poland since it became fully democratic in 1989. You had protests and demonstrations inside Poland and elsewhere in the world. The pictures that you see here represent protests against the law in Israel and for and against the law in Poland itself. Now, what is the background to this, and why was the law passed, and why did it cause such controversy, both inside the country and out, and what have been the further developments since the promulgation of the law in 2018? Well, for that, you have to go a long ways back in the history of the country, and one begins with the basic historical fact that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the lands of Poland, in its various forms, dating back to the early Middle Ages, became the largest single center of Jewish population and civilization in the entire world. You see here, for instance, a photograph of the Jewish district of the Polish city of Kraków in the 1920s. By 1939, the date that World War II broke out, Poland was home to the largest Jewry in the world, amounting to about 3 million people, about 1/10 of the population of the Second Polish Republic. And by the time you got to the 1930s, by the run-up to the Second World War, it is simply a fact that tensions between in Poland between the majority Polish Gentile population and Jews had been on the rise. Now, an aside here. As we go through the rest of the talk, I'm going to resort to the common usage of making a distinction between Poles on the one hand and Jews on the other. Now, I'm not entirely comfortable with this, because this seems at least to imply that one can't be both, that you can't be both Polish and Jewish. And of course, that's simply not the case. As a matter of fact, the great majority of people now living in Poland who would regard themselves as Jews by background or belief would regard themselves as Poles as well, simply as Poles who happen to be Jewish by identity as well. But as long as it's understood that I use the terms Poles and Jews as the sort of standard shorthand, then uh, we can proceed. Of course, World War II broke out in 1939, and it began uh, with an attack on Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And the war continued until 1945 and wrought wholesale destruction on the lands of Poland. Uh, the Second World War was the greatest catastrophe in the history of the Jewish people, and arguably for Poland and the non Jewish residents of Poland as well. Of course, for Jews, the Second World War is synonymous with the Holocaust, the attempted and nearly completed annihilation of European Jews conceived and carried out by Nazi Germany. Of two-thirds of the Jews of Europe died in the Holocaust. Of the Jews who lived in Poland and Eastern Europe, about 90% of them died. Roughly 3 million of the slightly over 3 and a fraction million Jews who lived in Poland in 1939 perished during the war. By the same token, not only Jews died or suffered in Eastern Europe uh, uh, during the war. Over 2 million Polish Gentiles did as well. Uh, what resulted was, if you will, competing and differing Jewish and Polish memories about the war and what it meant. For Jews, the story of the Holocaust, carried out largely on the territories of occupied Poland. And you see that represented in this slide by the map that shows the locations of the most notorious death factories set up by the Nazis, such as Treblinka and Beauzec and Sobibor. And as pictured in the upper right, the most notorious of them, Auschwitz-Birkenau, located not far from Krakow. Not all of the Holocaust was carried out by asphyxiation, but also many Jews died by mass shootings, the so-called Holocaust by bullets, as illustrated by the photograph in the lower right. For Jews, speaking in the main, and I'm afraid that time restraints will force me to very often in the course of this talk to try to simplify exceedingly complicated matters. But for Jews, the story of the Holocaust is that they were nearly wiped out, and no one was willing or able to save them. For Poles, the memory is slightly different. For Poles, who also lost a terrifically high percentage of their population, about 1 in 10 ethnic Poles perished during the war. For Poles, the story of the war was that Poland and Poles were valiant during the war. They were either heroes or victims. And as regards the Jews and the plight of the Jews, the Poles did what they could and did all that they could and cannot be held to blame for what happened to the Jews in Poland. But anyway, the Holocaust was carried out in Poland, as represented, among other things, by the pictures representing their mass extermination at the hands of the Nazis. Poland, and specifically the occupied Polish capital of Warsaw, was also the site of the largest single instance of Jewish armed resistance against the Nazis, the Warsaw Ghetto Rising of 1943. Now, before we go on any further, one thing should be made entirely clear. No Polish government conceived or helped carry out the Holocaust. This is a point on which all responsible historians agree. There was no functioning Polish government during World War II. There was no Polish Nazi puppet government as there was in other occupied countries that helped deliver up Jews to their deaths. The issue is not the actions of any sort of Polish government. The issue is, could Poles or Polish wartime leaders, the Polish government in exile, or the Polish resistance forces, or individual Poles or groups of Poles, could they have done more than they did to aid the Jews? Perhaps more to do with the subject of the remainder of this talk. To what extent were Poles, as individuals or members of groups, complicit in the destruction of Jews? Now, on one level, it is remarkable that any Poles felt moved to take the risk to give help to threatened Jews. Because in occupied Poland, unlike any other country occupied by the Nazis in Europe, the decree was handed down that the penalty for any assistance of whatever sort given to a Jew, if it was found by the German authorities, would be death. And you see here an example of the notification of this in both German and Polish. That notwithstanding, you did find numerous instances of efforts by Poles to assist or rescue Jews. The Polish government in exile and its home army resistance forces operating inside the country organized efforts to aid Jews under threat in occupied Poland. You see here photographs of Jan Karski, who served as a courier for the Polish government in exile, who saw with his own eyes what the Germans were doing in occupied Poland, deduced that this amounted to a concerted attempt not simply to kill or repress a lot of Jews, but to kill them all. And he went abroad to try to report on this to the governments of the United Kingdom and the United States of America. In the upper right, you see a picture of Irena Sendlerova, who used her status as a nurse to go into the Warsaw Ghetto and use this as a cover to help hundreds of Jews escape from the ghetto into the, well, I don't want to say the safety, but the less certain death of hiding out in the non-Jewish sectors of Poland and Warsaw. You see in the lower right a plaque dedicated to so-called righteous Gentiles, the righteous among the nations, non-Jews, who gave assistance to Jews during World War II, as recognized by the Museum of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. More Poles are recognized as righteous Gentiles than members of any other nation in occupied Europe. And yet, heroes are by definition a tiny minority in any country, everywhere. During World War II, the great majority of Poles did not try to rescue Jews. Most of them simply kept their heads low and tried to survive the war, as I dare say most of us would have done. However, it is a fact that is becoming clearer that during the war, tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Poles, we now know, blackmailed, betrayed, turned in Jews to the Germans, or killed Jews themselves. We know this as a result of historical research that has been undertaken in, let's say, the last 25 years or so since the fall of a communist dictatorship in Poland. This fact should not be surprising. Collaboration with the Nazis happened in all occupied countries of Europe. Those who found it convenient or easier to assist the Germans, to try to curry favor or out of fear or whatever motives, they greatly outnumbered the numbers of people who risked everything to aid the Jews. Not only that, but we also now know that the atmosphere of violence and injury done to Jews persisted into the disordered peacetime that followed the end of the war in 1945. Animus towards Jews still ran high within Polish society. There were numerous attacks on Jews undertaken in 1945, 1946, 1947, and the like, of which the best known and most notorious was a pogrom, that is a sort of concerted anti-Jewish attack on Jews in the Polish city of Kielce that was carried out in 1946 and resulted in the deaths of 42 Jews and injuries to many more. Now, what happened, of course, at the end of World War II was that Poland was subjected to 45 years, roughly, of domination by the Soviet Union and the imposition of a pro-Soviet communist regime. Now, under communism, discussion of Jewish matters was largely made a taboo. And there were strict limits placed on what was the permissible discussion, officially approved discussion of World War II and the Holocaust during the communist period. Uh, any such discussion was to be ideologized. In other words, it had to reflect prevailing communist belief. It was to be sanitized, and it was to be, if you will, de-Judaized. In other words, there was to be no particular emphasis or prominence given to the mass murder and repression of Jews as opposed to other people. When you spoke of German war crimes carried out in Poland, Jews were largely included in a list that otherwise emphasized communists, ethnic Poles, and other non-Jewish peoples. The, the, the implication was that one was to draw the conclusion that Jews had suffered no more during the war in Poland than any other people. And that, if you will, Polish suffering and Jewish suffering were equivalent. Well, this is simply not true. And this is borne out simply by the numbers. It's a crude measure, but you can't get away from it. 90% of Poland's Jews died during the war. 10%, in other words, an inverse proportion of ethnic Poles died during the war. By the same token, it must be said that what this did, this was maybe one of the few elements of communist policy that the majority of the Polish population would agree with, because what it did largely was to confirm the comforting image of Poles as either heroes or victims during the war. Now, moving on, there is little to praise in the record of the Polish communist regime's approach to Jewish matters. And perhaps the low point occurred in 1967 and 1968 with what is generally called the anti-Zionist campaign of those 2 years. And this was a curious and rather ominous and unpleasant episode, to put it mildly, that happened in the aftermath of orchestrated Soviet bloc condemnation of Israel following the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, because the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries, like Poland, officially backed the Arabs against the Arab countries against the victorious Israelis. Now, another thing that was going on was some sort of murky infighting among rival factions within the Polish communist regime, sort of maneuvering and jockeying for power by a curious combination of effects. What resulted was a public campaign of propaganda and abuse directed at so-called anti, at so-called Zionists inside Poland. In other words, real or purported backers of Israel and of Zionist policies related to Israel, which were declared to be incompatible with Polish communist patriotism. And this went on for several months in 1967 and 1968, and you can see images of that. For instance, now one thing to emphasize is you see, rallies of Communist Party faithful, and you see them holding signs that say, among other things, cleanse the party, cleanse the Communist Party of Zionists. Zionists should be sent back to Israel, so on and so forth. Now, the point here is that officially these threats and this abuse were directed at Zionists, but in fact it was directed again. The grounds for suspicion of anybody's loyalty was whether they were Jewish, and the anti-Zionist campaign made liberal use of the standard playbook of anti-Semitic stereotypes that have been known through the centuries. You see in the lower left, for instance, photographs of student protests against government policies. Government newspapers went out of their way to emphasize that some of the leaders of student protests against the regime were in fact Jews by background. One upshot of the anti-Zionist campaign was that in an atmosphere of threat and official pressure, over half of the remaining 30,000 Jews still living in Poland, the great majority, left the country not to return, in an atmosphere of governmental pressure to do so. Now, there followed over the next few years a beginning of a sort of breakup of the ice, if you will, off of the deep freeze into which the question of Polish-Jewish relations through the centuries had been placed during the communist years. In 1979, you had the visit to Poland of a newly elected Polish Pope, John Paul II. He visited the extermination site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, located not far from his former city of residence, Kraków, in Poland, and while he became the first pope to do so, to visit Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he made particular note during his visit to emphasize Auschwitz-Birkenau as a site of Jewish martyrdom. A few years later, in 1985, you had the release of the monumental documentary film Shoah, the Hebrew word for the Holocaust, directed by Claude Lanzmann. And this was a massive undertaking, 9 hours long, largely filmed in Poland, where the Holocaust took place, and it included footage that was interpreted by many Poles as accusatory of Poland, and they saw it as anti-Polish, and criticized Landsmann for what they thought was his taking advantage of the simplicity of Polish peasants who had lived through the Holocaust years, and using their testimony in a way to make them and their country look bad. However, it must also be pointed out that Shoah included the lengthy and harrowing testimony of none other than Jan Karski himself, the former Polish courier during World War II, who had tried to warn the world of the Holocaust then taking place in occupied Poland, and his testimony is moving indeed. What Shoah and the controversy over Shoah demonstrated was the first of a series of events that seemed to follow a pattern. Something was said or done to break the taboo on speaking of Polish-Jewish relations during World War II. Something was said or done to challenge the patriotic idea of Poles as having been only heroes or only victims. A controversy followed, and at the end of the controversy, there was general agreement that the discussion had been positive and clarifying. You had another example in 1987 with the appearance of an influential essay in Tygodnik Powszechny, which was a Krakow-based Catholic weekly published in Krakow, and this was an essay written by a noted Polish literary critic named Jan Błoński, and the title of it was "The Poor Poles Look on the Ghetto," and in it Błoński said in so many words this: we Poles have to get over this feeling of defensiveness about talking about the Holocaust. We can't simply go on ignoring it. It happened in our country. We weren't to blame for it, but it happened in our country. We have a moral and historical responsibility, as it were, to face this painful subject head on and to deal with it honestly, not simply to sort of bury it down a memory hole so that we're afraid for anybody to look into it for fear of what they may find. Again, a challenge to the notice to the idea of Poles as heroes or victims, a storm of criticism and controversy followed by a general agreement that progress had been made in looking into this subject. Now, in 1989, the communist regime in Poland fell, largely as the result of a semi-free election that brought into power a post-communist government represented by the Solidarity movement that resolved to turn Poland into a democracy. It did so successfully. And in the process, Poland and Polish historians liberated from communist censorship, uh, began the task of looking into historical issues that had been off limits or discouraged during the communist years. These included such subjects as relations between Poland and the Soviet Union. It included such subjects as the Katyn massacre or the Warsaw Rising of 1944. But it also included a re-examination of the history of Jews on the Polish lands and of Polish-Jewish relations through the years. And the result was a remarkable outpouring of new historical research and publication on these subjects, aided by the new atmosphere of free expression, the opening up of archives, and other sources of information that had been closed to researchers during the communist years. And one of the best known achievements of this, it's often called a Jewish revival of sorts inside post-communist Poland, was the opening in the year 2013 of the museum that came to be called Polin, or the Museum for the History of Polish Jews, located on the site of the location of what had been the World War II Warsaw Ghetto, and represented here by several pictures of the museum. But one result of this new historical research into Polish-Jewish history of World War II was the revelation that the scope of the involvement or the complicity of individual Poles in acts of violence or criminality against Jews during World War II was greater than had been recognized up till that point. The standard story had been that, yes, incidents like this had happened, but they were the actions of a very tiny minority. Well, it rather soon became clear that that was not the case. That the numbers of such incidents were greater and of greater significance than had previously been realized. And the best noted of these, and the most influential of them, was the publication in the year 2000 of a book by the Polish-born American resident scholar Jan Tomasz Gross, of a book called in Polish Sąsiedzi, and in English as Neighbors. And what Gross did in Neighbors was to tell the story of the massacre of the Jewish residents in a small eastern Polish town called Jedwabne in the summer of 1941. This massacre had long been ascribed to the Germans, but Gross revealed in this book that it actually had been carried out by the Polish residents of Jedwabne. In other words, the Jews of Jedwabne had been done in by their very neighbors. This created a sensation and an extensive public and scholarly controversy. Now, um, Gross got some details wrong, and this was pointed out in the discussion that followed. But his main point, that the massacre had been carried out by Poles and not by Germans, was ultimately recognized by the great majority of historians and by Polish authorities as well. And you see in the lower right-hand corner the Polish president, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, in a ceremony in the year 2001 for the dedication of a new memorial at Jedwabne, expressing a description of the events that had happened there in 1941 closer to the truth than had previously been realized, and apologizing in the name of the Polish nation. Um, Other historical revelations of this sort followed. Now, it wasn't simply these scholarly researches that became seen by many Poles as problematic. There was also the use of the phrase Polish death camps to describe the German death sites, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau or Majdanek, that happened to be located on Polish soil. This phrase, Polish death camps, it was used fairly frequently, and this got on Poles' nerves. And it's to be admitted for good reason. Uh, this was generally not stated out of malice, but as a matter of, if you will, geographic carelessness. Uh, Nobody was really trying to say, well, these were uh, these were death sites, operated by Poland. It was understood that they were German death sites, but calling them Polish was a way of simply saying that's where they were located. However, it could and did cause confusion, and Poland took great offense at this when it happened. And one notable instance of this happened in 2012, ironically and embarrassingly, when the President of the United States, Barack Obama, used the phrase Polish death camps in the process of conferring a posthumous Presidential Medal of Honor on Jan Karski, the very Polish the very Polish courier who had tried to warn the world about the Holocaust. Well, this caused a furor. I can well remember it because I was in Poland at the time when it happened. The government of Poland, the government of Poland at the time, not the Law and Justice government of now, but its predecessor, demanded and received a retraction and an apology. But nevertheless, this was an issue that sort of stuck in the craw of Poles, and very much, and they very much wanted to work against. Well, this was particularly pronounced among the followers of the Law and Justice Party. And when the Law and Justice Party won elections in 2015, it did so with a platform that included the idea of emphasizing what it called a pedagogy of pride regarding Polish history, as opposed to what it called a pedagogy of shame. That meaning that Poles should be taught to take pride in their history. Uh, they should not be subjected to attempts uh, to say that there was anything shameful about being Polish or anything in Polish history that they should be ashamed of. And while it went unsaid, it was well understood that perhaps the most sensitive of these issues had to do with the Second World War. And shortly after he was elected, uh, President Duda, an ally of the Law and Justice Party and government, stated publicly, as you say here, confirmed this, that conducting historical policy, that is, the government should make it a matter of policy to encourage a particular view of Polish history that stressed patriotic values. Conducting this historical policy is one of the most important activities of the president. And this brings us, at last, you may say, to the meat of the talk, the heart of the matter. What happened in 2018 and the passage of the amendment to the Act on the Institute of National Remembrance, or the Polish Holocaust speech law, if you will. Now, when it was passed, as I've already mentioned, it came in for broad criticism, both public and by legal and scholarly experts. For one thing, the law was criticized as being broadly and imprecisely written. For instance, let us say, take one example, let us say an elderly Holocaust survivor expressed criticism of Poland or Polish actions during the Holocaust. Might he or she be subject to prosecution and up to 3 years of imprisonment? Well, that was hard to say. There was nothing in the law that prevented that. Further, if you look at element 3, which on its surface says, well, you know, if you're a historian and you say something in the process of your legitimate historical work that you know might reflect badly on Poland, then you're exempted. You don't have to worry about that. On the other hand, as we will see, you know, it was precisely historians who became the targets of threats to invoke this law or other similar provisions in Polish law that could be found. And furthermore, you know, what was meant by the Polish nation? Uh, you know, the Polish nation or the Republic of Poland. Um, Did that include only a Polish government? Did the Polish nation include all Poles everywhere? Or could it be construed to say that could Polish nation be construed in a way to say that, hey, if you say that Poles individually were complicit in the Holocaust, well, then you're subject to this law. Again, this was imprecise. It was unclear. It was open to interpretation. Um, Now, even at the time, you know, most polls, most public opinion polls inside Poland, no, no pun intended, most polls indicated that the majority of Poles uh, opposed this law. Yes, they might have agreed there was a problem. There was a problem to be dealt with. The use of the term Polish death camps, and that was the purpose for which the law was mainly sold by the government. We want to stop people from using the phrase Polish death camps. Well, maybe that purpose was well and good, but most people inside Poland even seem to think the law was a crude instrument. It was overkill. What it was taking a sledgehammer and trying to criminalize what was, in fact, more properly a more delicate matter of education. Well, be that as it may, upon the passage of the law in February 2018, this triggered a stormy reaction in Poland and around the world, such as I've already mentioned, that you see here. This resonated in public and in governmental circles. And rather quickly, it must be said, the Polish government concluded that it had miscalculated and it was going to be required to retreat. For one thing, the passage of the law stirred strong protests from Israel, from the government of Israel, and scholarly societies inside Israel, not to mention the Israeli public. And the Polish government did not want to jeopardize its relatively good relations with Israel. There was also the fact that the United States of America, Poland's most powerful ally, expressed strong disapproval of the law and apparently put quiet pressure on Poland to modify or retract the law or else suffer the consequences. As a result, in June of 2018, the Polish government proposed, and the legislature subsequently approved, amendments to the law that, for the most part, what it did was to eliminate the criminal penalties for violation of the law. In other words, offenders who were convicted would not be subject to the threat of imprisonment. They would be subject to civil penalties. They could be sued, but they would not be imprisoned. In the aftermath of this, the Polish and Israeli governments issued a joint statement declaring themselves satisfied with the outcome of the controversy, and it was hoped that the hubbub would die down. However, this came to be seen, or it can be seen, as part of a larger pattern of actions undertaken by the current Polish government, or encouraged by the current Polish government, to use this law, or, as I've already mentioned, similar means of pressure, legal or political, to obtain the same result. That is, to discourage any discussion of Polish actions during the Holocaust that would challenge their idea of the priority that should be given to the quote-unquote pedagogy of pride. For instance, what has happened in the last few years is a government takeover of museums in the country that have to do either entirely or in part with World War II and the Holocaust. For instance, on the left, you see the building of a museum of World War II that was opened in the Polish city of Gdańsk a few years ago. Now, in its original conception, this was to be a museum that was to tell the entire story of the Second World War, worldwide, from start to finish. It was a project that enlisted the efforts of many of the most prominent historians of the subject around the world, in Poland and abroad. Ultimately, the museum was, the leadership of the museum was dismissed by the government on the grounds that the direction of the museum had to be changed, that in its original conception it had not emphasized the role of Poland or told the story of Poland enough or in the proper way. And so a new team was installed, and the exhibit of the museum was altered along the lines that the government directed. I can relate something of a personal involvement here, that being that at the time I edited a historical journal that chose to honor as the best article published in the journal in a given year a piece written by two of the curators of the World War II Museum in its original conception, telling the story of the idea behind the museum, how it would be different from any other World War II museum around the world, and to tell the story of the war in the broadest possible terms. Well, by the time they appeared at our meeting in Krakow to bestow upon them the award for the best article of the year, they had already been fired, and essentially their work at the museum undone, which put something of a pall over the ceremonies, as you might imagine. On the right, you see a picture of the Polish historian Dariusz Stola, a world-renowned historian of modern Polish times, who served as the director of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews from 2014 until fairly recently. fairly recently because he was, in effect, dismissed from his position as director of the museum by government order. Uh, and it was noticed that this happened after governmental expression of displeasure over an exhibit that had been mounted at the museum over the events of 1968 and the mass emigration of Polish Jews under under pressure from the then communist government. If you go to the site of the Polin Museum today, you will find, in fact, a rather remarkable statement by the historian who succeeded him as director of the museum, saying, in effect, you know, I really should not be the director of the museum. The dismissal of Professor Stola was completely unjustified, and you know, we hope to carry on the work as best we can, as he did. There have been more recent examples as well. Just within the last couple of weeks, as I speak, two Polish scholars, Jan Grabowski, Polish-born but now resident in Canada, and the Polish scholar Barbara Engelking. Well, in 2018, they co-edited a book that you see represented in the upper left hand, called in Polish Dalej jest Noc, and in English the title would be Night Without End. And this was a massive investigation running nearly 1,700 pages on the fate of Jews in certain parts of occupied Poland during World War II. Now, Engelking and Grabowski were sued by the niece of, sued with assistance from a pro-Polish government lobby, sued by the niece of a rural World War II mayor over whether he did or did not turn over Jews to Germans during World War II. The historical evidence was murky and complicated and conflicting. This happens. The editors of the book chose to believe the testimony of a Jewish survivor who said that the mayor had done that he was guilty of that. They chose to trust that testimony over the verdict of a communist-era Polish court that had acquitted him of the charge. The Polish court sided with the plaintiffs. Grabowski and Engelking were ordered to apologize. The verdict is currently under appeal. Also, within the past few days, the editor of a Jewish website in Poland was questioned by Polish police for possible violation of a certain article in Polish criminal code that threatens up to 3 years imprisonment for insulting the Polish nation or the Republic. Now, we're coming to the end. I'm sure you'll be happy to hear that. What has been the result of this? What has been the upshot of the so-called Polish Holocaust speech law of 2018 and the use or the encouragement by the current Polish government to use that or similar articles to obtain the result? Well, not wanting to sound as if I am taking sides here. We're taking partisan sides in a Polish dispute. But the cold fact is that even from the standpoint of the intentions of the Polish government, that is to protect the good name of Poland, the results of this effort have been almost totally negative and counterproductive. For instance, it has resulted in Poland finding itself having brought on what has been called the biggest diplomatic crisis it has experienced since the beginnings of democratic Poland in 1989. It wanted to stamp out the use of the term Polish death camps. And yet, if anything, the controversy over efforts to stamp it out by the means they have chosen to do have caused it to be used more frequently. There is apparently one study that says that internet searches for the term Polish death camps are now 9 times greater than they were before passage of the law in 2018. Now, it is also fair to say that each and all of these various efforts that I have spoken of throughout the past hour, all of these efforts by the current Polish government to pursue its quote-unquote historical policy have been protested and condemned by the great majority of historians and historical organizations, both in Poland and around the world. Well, why? Why would they do this? Well, for one thing, we simply don't know yet the full story of what happened in Poland during the Holocaust years. This is still a matter of ongoing research. It is a matter that at this point should probably be left to the historians to find out. That's what historians do. That's what they're supposed to do. Their job, their mission, is to record and explain the truth of the past as best they can so that we can learn from it. But one problem is that there seems a reasonable amount of evidence that even though the Polish government's efforts to use the law to discourage the use of the injurious term Polish death camps, even though that hasn't worked, it has succeeded, if you want to use that term, in possibly chilling historical inquiry into this very crucial and important subject. Older established historians are being subjected to harassment, while younger, more vulnerable apprentice historians are, we are told by our Polish colleagues, feeling pressure to avoid the subject of the Holocaust altogether for fear of the consequences, for fear of repercussions, for fear of legal consequences. Look, pretty much all countries, not just Poland, pretty much all countries hope and try to use history as a positive force in instilling national pride and encouraging good citizenship. That happens everywhere, granted. But it's a different thing when governments go beyond that and they try to punish or criminalize or muzzle views of history they don't like. That's usually the approach of dictatorships. In the end, all countries, any country, the United States included, they have pages in their history that they can point to with pride. But they also have pages that are darker, that are painful, that are uncomfortable to look at. When I was growing up in the United States, as an American, we were taught, or was taken for granted, that the arrival of Columbus and the other Europeans to the New World was a complete and positive good. We were taught that cowboys were the heroes and Indians were the villains. We weren't told much about the ill effects of slavery. It was possible to argue then that, maybe slavery had its good points as well as its bad points. We weren't told much about the record of lynchings or the effects of Jim Crow in the Deep South. We know better now. It is sobering and perhaps instructive for us to know and understand as Americans that Hitler looked on the American treatment of the Indians as a precedent to follow in his own campaign of conquest and suppression and extermination of peoples, including the Poles, who lived to the east of Germany. And perhaps we are wiser and better off for understanding that. And we can learn from it and resolve to do better. In many ways, I would argue the willingness to confront, to examine, and when necessary, to tell the unvarnished truth about uncomfortable pages of national history is one of the surest signs of a healthy and democratic society. Since the establishment of a democratic Poland in 1989, Polish historians have done a remarkable job in filling in the blank spots of national history. To my mind, and I dare say not mine alone, one of the best ways to protect the good name of Poland would be to let those historians continue to do that, to do their job. Thank you for your attention.